United States can't handle the demand. They don't grow enough to supply the United States of America.
American farmers claim failed to keep underpriced Mexican imports from flooding the market.
It would hit families already struggling to afford groceries.
I just spent over $100 on just this alone.
Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum on Tuesday criticized U.S. President Donald Trump's move to impose tariffs on Mexican tomatoes.
Today, President Trump heads to Pittsburgh to focus on domestic energy and tech development, while his administration ratchets up his tariff policy. Monday, the Commerce Department announced a 17% tariff on most imported tomatoes from Mexico.
Mexico's patience had finally run out. For years, Mexican tomato growers had worked tirelessly to maintain their competitive edge in the U.S. market, despite repeated challenges. They improved their quality, offered lower prices, and even came forward with proposals that favored U.S. consumers. Yet Washington turned them away, not for reasons of economics, but politics. When the U.S. Department of Commerce confirmed the 17.09% anti-dumping duty on Mexican tomatoes, it was a slap in the face. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum didn't mince words. Standing before her nation in her morning press conference, she called the tax unjust and made clear that Mexico would not stand idly by. This wasn't just a policy dispute. It was an insult to a key agricultural sector, to hardworking farmers, and to the spirit of fair trade. The reality was stark. The U.S. had long relied on Mexican tomatoes, especially during the winter months when American fields lay dormant. Mexican tomatoes will continue to be exported even with the tariff, Sheinbaum said, because there is no substitute. Her words carried a calm but unshakable defiance. This was not a leader pleading for mercy. This was a leader preparing a countermove. Behind the scenes, consultations began with growers, associations, and trade negotiators. The president hinted that a set of measures would be announced soon under Plan Mexico, aimed at protecting domestic producers and strengthening the local market. But there was a second, sharper edge to these discussions. If the U.S. wanted to escalate trade aggression, Mexico was prepared to strike where it hurt. Across the border, U.S. importers were already worried. They knew that Mexican tomatoes weren't just another import, they were a staple. Restaurants, supermarkets, and food processors depended on them daily. A sharp reduction in Mexican tomato supply would ripple through the U.S. economy, raising prices for consumers and putting pressure on American food industries. This wasn't the first trade battle under Donald Trump's influence. The former president's aggressive tariff policies had alienated not just Mexico, but the European Union, Canada, and multiple Asian partners. His recent threat of a 30% tariff on EU and Mexican imports, set for August 1st, only deepened the perception of the United States as a hostile trading partner. In Brussels and Mexico City, the sentiment was the same. Enough was enough. Mexico's countermove came quietly at first. Growers, who had been shipping steady volumes of tomatoes north, began scaling back exports. It wasn't a total halt. Mexico still valued its U.S. market, but it was a calculated tightening. Priority shipments were redirected to other international buyers and, more importantly, to strengthen the domestic market. By focusing on local distribution, Mexico not only shielded its farmers from the full brunt of the tariff, but also reduced dependence on a volatile neighbor. Within weeks, U.S. importers began to feel the pinch. Prices climbed, shelves saw less variety, and food companies reliant on steady tomato supply began scrambling for alternatives. But Sheinbaum's statement rang true. There was no substitute. Other suppliers couldn't match the quality, volume, or price of Mexican tomatoes. The move wasn't just economic, it was political chess. Mexico knew that its tomatoes were an integral part of American consumer life. By controlling the flow, it could exert pressure without violating trade laws. This wasn't a reckless retaliation. It was a strategic adjustment designed to send a message. Mexico would no longer absorb blows without response. Meanwhile, in European capitals, Trump's tariff threats were reigniting old disputes. The EU, already in trade talks with Mexico, saw an opportunity. European buyers, eager to diversify supply chains, began increasing imports from Mexican producers. This shift not only mitigated Mexico's losses from the U.S. market, but also strengthened Mexico's position as a global agricultural player. In Mexico, tomato producers felt a mix of relief and pride. For years, they had been at the mercy of Washington's policy swings. Now, for the first time in recent memory, they saw their government taking decisive action to defend their interests. Subsidies, logistical support, and alternative export arrangements were being lined up as part of Plan Mexico. Across the border, frustration mounted. Trump's supporters in the agricultural sector had assumed that tariffs would protect American farmers. Instead, the disruption exposed weaknesses in domestic production capacity. Even with tariffs in place, U.S. growers couldn't meet demand. Consumers bore the cost, paying higher prices for a product that had once been abundant. Sheinbaum's government kept communication channels open with Washington, but the tone was firm. Mexico was willing to negotiate, but not from a position of weakness. The rejection of Mexico's earlier proposals for political reasons had set the stage for a harder stance. If Trump's America wanted to treat trade as a battlefield, Mexico was prepared to respond in kind. The strategic reduction in exports became a rallying point. In Mexican media, headlines celebrated the government's stand. Farmers from Sinaloa to Baja California spoke of newfound dignity in their trade relations. International analysts noted that Mexico's approach, targeted, patient, and calculated, was a masterclass in trade diplomacy under pressure. By late summer, the effects were undeniable. U.S. consumer groups began voicing complaints. Grocery chains pushed back against the tariffs, warning that shortages and price hikes were damaging the retail sector. Political pressure mounted, and even some of Trump's allies began to question the wisdom of antagonizing a key neighbor over a product that Americans clearly needed. Mexico's quiet strength became evident. It hadn't launched a loud trade war. It had simply rebalanced the table. Other nations, watching closely, took note. Canada, the EU, and even some Asian economies began exploring more coordinated responses to US tariffs. Trump's aggressive stance, meant to force concessions, was instead uniting America's trade partners in resistance. Inside Mexico, Plan Mexico unfolded in full force. Government programs supported cold storage, expanded processing facilities, and opened new shipping routes to Europe and Asia. Mexican tomatoes, once heavily dependent on the US market, began finding new homes on European supermarket shelves and Asian restaurant menus. Sheinbaum's administration emphasized self-reliance without severing ties. "We are not closing the door to the United States," she told reporters, "but we are making sure that door is no longer the only one." This was more than rhetoric. It was a long-term shift in Mexico's trade posture. As autumn approached, the US tomato market remained tight. Importers pushed for resolution, but Washington hesitated. Backing down would be politically costly for Trump, whose brand was built on appearing tough in negotiations. Yet the reality was becoming clear. Mexico held a stronger position than the tariff architects had anticipated. The checkmate came not in a dramatic announcement, but in a slow, grinding realization. Trump's aggressive tactics had failed to force Mexico into submission. Instead, they had pushed Mexico to diversify, strengthen, and emerge more independent. For Mexico, this was a victory beyond tomatoes. It was a demonstration that even smaller economies could stand firm against the world's largest when armed with strategy, patience, and a willingness to endure short-term pain for long-term gain. For the US, it was a costly lesson in the limits of tariff diplomacy. In the end, Mexican tomatoes continued to cross the border, but on Mexico's terms. Exports were calibrated, markets diversified, and domestic producers better supported than before. The once vulnerable sector had been transformed into a symbol of national resilience. Trump's tariff gambit, intended to show strength, had instead revealed vulnerability. And Mexico, far from bowing to pressure, had played its hand with precision, turning a punitive measure into a catalyst for independence. Around the world, other nations watched and learned. The message was clear. When faced with aggression, coordinated strategy and economic patience could turn the tables. Mexico had not just defended its tomatoes, it had defended its sovereignty. And in doing so, it had sent a warning to every trading partner. Respect is a two-way street. In the simmering tension of international trade, Mexico had found its moment. And with each crate of tomatoes redirected, each new export deal signed, and each domestic farm strengthened, it reminded the world that it was not a passive player in global markets. It was, and would remain, a nation capable of defending its interests, no matter how big the opponent.